The Mongol Armada, when the Khan conquered the seas. What if the largest empire in human history didn't stop at the ocean's edge? In 1274, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, ruler of the largest contiguous empire ever assembled, stands on the shores of China, gazing eastward across the Sea of Japan. His armies have conquered everything from Korea to Hungary. His empire spans 24 million square kilometers, larger than any realm before or since. But there's one target that has eluded him: Japan. And beyond Japan, an entire world across the Pacific that he doesn't even know exists. History tells us the Khan tried twice to invade Japan. Both times, his fleets were destroyed by typhoons the Japanese called kamikaze. Act 1. The Discovery. The storm that changed nothing. August 15th, 1281. The largest invasion fleet ever assembled in East Asian history approached the shores of Kyushu, Japan. 4,400 ships. Approximately 140,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean warriors. It was Kublai Khan's second attempt to subjugate Japan, and this time he was certain of victory. In our timeline, a massive typhoon struck the fleet on August 15th and 16th. Thousands of ships sank. Tens of thousands of men drowned. The invasion collapsed. Japan was saved by what seemed like divine intervention, and the Mongol Empire's eastern expansion ended forever. But in this alternate history, something different happened. The Khan's engineers, veterans of sieges from Baghdad to Kiev, had learned from the first failed invasion 7 years earlier. They had studied Chinese shipbuilding techniques, Korean naval architecture, and borrowed innovations from captured Song dynasty admirals. The Second Fleet wasn't just larger, it was fundamentally different. Instead of flat-bottomed river vessels hastily converted for ocean warfare, the Khan's new armada consisted of deep-hulled, ocean-going junks with watertight compartments. The ships had multiple masts, balanced rudders, and could sail into the wind, technology that European vessels wouldn't match for another 2 centuries. When the typhoon struck, the fleet didn't shatter. The Eastern Hunger. Kublai Khan had accomplished what no ruler before him had achieved. His empire now controlled both the world's largest landmass and access to the world's largest ocean. And he discovered something that would transform history. Among the Japanese prisoners were sailors and fishermen who spoke of vast fishing grounds far to the east, beyond the horizon. They described currents that flowed toward the rising sun, warm waters that could carry ships for weeks without sight of land. The Khan, ever ambitious, ordered exploration. In 1284, he commissioned what historians would later call the Eastern Fleet, 50 ships under the command of a Mongol general named Bayan and a Chinese admiral named Zhu. Their mission: explore the Eastern Ocean, find new lands, and claim them for the Khan. The fleet departed from conquered Japan in April 1284, riding the Kuroshio Current northward before catching the prevailing westerlies that would carry them across the Pacific. They sailed for 73 days without sighting land. And then, in July 1284, they made landfall on the coast of what we call Alaska. The Mongol Empire had reached the Americas 213 years before Columbus, 511 years before Bering's expedition. But unlike later European explorers, they arrived with the military might of history's greatest conquest machine behind them. What happened next would alter the fate of continents. But the evidence forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that the indigenous peoples of the Americas might have been better prepared for this first contact than they would be for the European arrival that followed in our timeline. Act 2. Accumulating evidence. The Aleutian Gateway. Historical reconstructions from this alternative timeline reveal something extraordinary. The Mongol landing in Alaska wasn't a one-time exploratory mission, it became a permanent settlement corridor. The Aleutian Islands, stretching from Alaska toward Asia like stepping stones, provided the perfect route for sustained contact. Unlike the vast Atlantic that separated Europe from America, the North Pacific route was punctuated by islands where ships could resupply, repair, and shelter from storms. By 1286, Mongol trading posts dotted the Aleutian chain. The Aleut peoples, sophisticated marine hunters with their own complex society, initially resisted. But the Mongols, experienced in incorporating conquered peoples into their empire, offered a different approach than European colonizers would later employ. The Mongols didn't seek to convert or culturally erase, they sought tribute and trade. Aleut hunting techniques, particularly their kayak technology and marine mammal knowledge, were respected and incorporated. In exchange, the Aleuts received metal tools, weapons, and protection from rival groups. Within a decade, a hybrid culture emerged. Aleut maritime expertise merged with Mongol organizational systems. The settlements became launching points for further exploration down the Pacific coast.
The Pacific Silkroad. By 1290, Mongol ships were regularly traversing what historians would call the Pacific Silk Road, a maritime trade route connecting Asia to the Americas. The economic implications were staggering. American resources began flowing westward: furs from Alaska, timber from the Pacific Northwest, eventually turquoise and jade from regions farther south. In exchange, Asian goods flowed east: silk, gunpowder, paper, metallurgy, and most importantly, diseases for which American populations had no immunity. But here's where this timeline diverges dramatically from European colonization. The disease exchange happened gradually over decades rather than catastrophically over a few years. The indigenous populations of Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, perhaps 50,000 people in the contact zone, were devastated by smallpox, measles, and other Eurasian diseases. Mortality rates reached 40 to 60% over the first generation of contact. This was tragic but manageable. Populations recovered, communities adapted. Crucially, diseases spread southward relatively slowly through the Americas, allowing populations to develop partial immunity over multiple generations before the full disease load arrived. By the time Mongol explorers reached California in 1295, the indigenous peoples they encountered had already heard stories of the newcomers and the ghost sickness that accompanied them. Some groups actively isolated themselves. Others sought early contact to acquire immunity while their populations were still strong.
The Chinggisid Conquest Doctrine. The most remarkable aspect of Mongol-American colonization was how different it looked from European colonization. The Mongols operated under what historians call the Chinggisid Conquest Doctrine, a sophisticated imperial philosophy developed over decades of ruling diverse populations from China to Persia. The doctrine was simple: submit, pay tribute, and keep your culture. Resist and face total annihilation. When Mongol forces encountered the complex chiefdoms of the Pacific Northwest, Tlingit, Haida, Salish peoples, with sophisticated art, marine technology, and social structures, they offered terms: pay annual tribute in furs and resources, provide warriors for Mongol military campaigns, and accept a Mongol governor to oversee trade. Many groups, calculating survival, accepted. By 1300, a network of tribute-paying indigenous states extended from Alaska to California, nominally subject to Kublai Khan, and, after his death in 1294, his successors, but maintaining substantial internal autonomy. The Mongols established fortified trading posts at strategic points, but didn't attempt to occupy the entire territory. It was a colonization of a different kind: extraction rather than settlement, tribute rather than replacement. But this represents just one piece of a much larger puzzle hidden in what happened when Mongol explorers pushed farther south. The Mesoamerican Contact. The most remarkable discovery involves what happened when two of history's greatest military powers finally met. In 1308, Mongol expeditionary forces reached Central America and encountered the remnants of the Maya civilization and the rising power of the Mexica, Aztec Empire. Unlike the hunter-gatherer and chiefdom societies of the north, these were complex state societies with cities, agriculture, writing systems, and sophisticated military organizations. The Aztecs had been expanding their own empire through military conquest and tribute extraction. The parallels were striking, and both sides recognized it. The first contact occurred near what is now the Mexico-Guatemala border. A Mongol cavalry force of approximately 500 men encountered an Aztec tributary army of several thousand. In our timeline's later European contact, such encounters ended in indigenous defeat despite numerical superiority, primarily due to steel weapons, horses, and gunpowder. But in this timeline, something different happened. The Aztecs had received advanced warning, decades of stories filtering south about strange invaders from the north. They had adapted their warfare tactics. When the Mongol cavalry charged, Aztec warriors deployed ranks of atlatl throwers, spear launchers, and archery units that focused fire on the horses, neutralizing the cavalry advantage. The battle was brutal and ended in strategic stalemate. Both sides withdrew to reassess. What followed was unprecedented: negotiation. The Great Accommodation. Between 1308 and 1312, Mongol and Aztec representatives held a series of meetings that historians call the Great Accommodation. The Mongols, pragmatic empire builders, recognized that conquering Mesoamerica would be costly and potentially impossible. The Aztecs, equally pragmatic, understood that extended warfare with these northern invaders would drain resources needed to maintain their own tribute empire. They reached an agreement. The Aztec Empire would pay annual tribute to the Mongol Khan, gold, jade, obsidian, cacao, through Mongol trading posts on the coast. In exchange, the Mongols would provide military technology, particularly metallurgy, stay out of Aztec internal affairs, and not interfere with Aztec tributary relationships with other Mesoamerican peoples. Most significantly, the Mongols granted the Aztecs what they called co-imperium status, recognition as a fellow imperial power rather than a conquered province. It was colonialism's opposite, mutual recognition between empires. But the cultural exchange that followed was even more consequential than the political accommodation.
The Trans-Pacific Exchange. The evidence extends beyond politics into the realm of transformative cultural and technological exchange. Between 1310 and 1350, the Pacific Silkroad carried not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and even people in both directions. Westward to Asia, American crops transformed Asian agriculture. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, and chili peppers reached China, Mongolia, and Persia centuries before they would in our timeline. The impact on Asian population growth was profound. Regions that would later sustain famines in our timeline instead experienced agricultural surplus. Eastward to America, metallurgy, the wheel, for pottery and construction if not transport in the mountainous terrain, writing systems based on Chinese characters, and crucially, horses and other Eurasian domesticated animals. By 1340, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan had a population exceeding 400,000, making it one of the largest cities in the world. It also had a Mongol quarter, where Asian merchants traded silk for obsidian, and scholars from China taught mathematics to Aztec priests.
Mesoamerican calendrical systems, already sophisticated, incorporated Chinese astronomical observations. Aztec craftsmen used steel tools while maintaining their lapidary traditions. Horses became prestige animals in Aztec society, though the mountainous terrain limited their military applications. The most stunning development? By 1345, limited but regular ship traffic crossed the Pacific in both directions. Chinese merchants seeking American goods, Aztec envoys traveling to the Khan's court. A world system emerging that connected Asia and America, with Europe still completely unaware that America existed. And then, everything changed when the plague came.
Act 3. The Big Picture. The Black Death goes global. What historians discovered studying this alternative timeline reveals a profound horror. When disease has more pathways, pandemics become truly global catastrophes. In our timeline, the Black Death, bubonic plague, erupted from Central Asia in the 1330s, traveled along the Silk Road, and devastated Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia between 1347 and 1353. It killed perhaps 75 to 200 million people, up to 60% of Europe's population. But the Americas remained untouched, protected by oceanic isolation. In the alternative timeline, the plague traveled along both the traditional Silk Road and the Pacific Silkroad. By 1348, plague-infected rats on Mongol trading vessels reached California. By 1350, the disease had spread through indigenous trade networks into the interior of North America. By 1352, it reached Mesoamerica. The American populations, having had 60 to 70 years of gradual exposure to smallpox and measles, had no defense against plague. The mortality was apocalyptic. Estimates suggest 40 to 50% of the indigenous American population died between 1348 and 1360, perhaps 20–25 million people. Entire cities were abandoned. Trade networks collapsed. Chiefdoms in states that had negotiated with the Mongols ceased to exist. The Aztec Empire, which had grown wealthy from Pacific trade, saw its population crash from over 6 million to perhaps 3 million. But this forced a reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about pandemic response.
The isolation protocols. The simultaneous plague outbreak across 3 continents did something unprecedented. It forced international cooperation on disease management. By 1355, as the pandemic began to wane, Mongol administrators implemented what they called quarantine stations at major Pacific ports. Ships were required to anchor offshore for 40 days, quarantina in Italian, though the practice emerged independently in multiple cultures, before crews could disembark. The Aztecs, devastated by the plague, adopted similar measures. They also implemented something radical, a courier system that shared disease information across vast distances. If plague broke out in one region, fast runners carried warnings to distant cities, allowing them to implement isolation measures before the disease arrived. These were the first international public health protocols, emerging from catastrophe but creating infrastructure that would save millions of lives in future outbreaks. The plague also transformed empire building itself. The Mongol Empire, which had reached its maximum territorial extent, began contracting. The cost of maintaining global trade routes while managing pandemic disease proved unsustainable. Between 1360 and 1400, the Pacific Silkroad traffic declined by roughly 70%. The Great Age of Mongol maritime expansion ended not through military defeat, but through biological catastrophe. Yet the connections, once established, never entirely disappeared.
The Ming Reversal. In 1368, the Mongol Yuan dynasty in China was overthrown by the Ming dynasty, just as in our timeline. But the Ming encountered something different, an established trans-Pacific trade network. The early Ming emperors, particularly the Hongwu Emperor, were deeply suspicious of foreign entanglements. In our timeline, this suspicion led to the cessation of Zheng He's treasure voyages and Chinese withdrawal from oceanic exploration. In the alternative timeline, the Ming faced a harder choice: shut down Pacific trade and lose access to American silver, or maintain the routes established by their Mongol predecessors. Economics won. The Ming established the Eastern Ocean Trade Company in 1380, a state-controlled monopoly on trans-Pacific commerce. Chinese ships, the largest and most sophisticated in the world, began regular voyages to America. But here's where it gets strange. The Ming Chinese, unlike the conquest-oriented Mongols, approached America as purely a trade opportunity. They established fortified trading posts on the California coast, but showed no interest in territorial expansion. Recent breakthroughs in studying this timeline suggest the Ming attitude toward America was remarkably similar to their attitude towards Southeast Asia: valuable trading partners, not territories to conquer. By 1400, a Chinese merchant community existed in what is now San Francisco Bay, trading silk and porcelain for American silver and sea otter pelts. The settlement was perhaps 5,000 people: Chinese merchants, indigenous laborers, and a mixed heritage population.
The European discovery of discovery. This leads to one of the most mind-bending implications. When Europeans finally reached the Americas in this alternative timeline, they discovered they were late to the party. Christopher Columbus still made his voyage in 1492, still reached the Caribbean, still believed he had found Asia. But when Spanish conquistadors reached the mainland in the early 1500s, they encountered something shocking: Aztec warriors wielding steel weapons, indigenous peoples who had horses, coastal settlements with Asian architectural influences, and most baffling of all, Chinese trading ships in American harbors. The Spanish initially believed they had somehow circumnavigated the globe and reached Asia from the east. When they realized these were previously unknown continents with established Asian trading relationships, the geopolitical implications were staggering. Spain, Portugal, and other European powers suddenly found themselves competing not just with each other for American wealth, but with the Ming Chinese, who had been trading there for over a century. The colonial era that followed was fundamentally different. European settlers couldn't simply overwhelm indigenous populations because those populations had been integrated into Pan-Pacific trade networks for 200 years. They had metal tools, some immunity to Eurasian diseases, and diplomatic relationships with Asian powers. The colonization of America became a three-way competition: European, Asian, and indigenous powers, all maneuvering for advantage.
The globalization that came early. By 1550, in this alternative timeline, something remarkable had emerged: genuine globalization. Silver from American mines flowed to both Europe through Spanish colonies and China through Pacific trade. Chinese silk and porcelain reached European markets through both traditional Silk Road routes and new trans-Pacific routes via America. Indigenous American crops had transformed agriculture on 3 continents. The world economy was integrated in ways that wouldn't occur in our timeline until the 19th century, and it happened 300 years earlier. But the social implications were even more profound. By 1600, major cities on 4 continents had cosmopolitan populations. Aztec nobles in Beijing studying Confucian philosophy, Chinese merchants in Mexico City, European traders in Manila negotiating with indigenous American groups, and indigenous American scholars in Madrid analyzing Ming maritime technology. The concept of distinct civilizations began breaking down. A global culture, or at least a global elite culture, began emerging. The implications rippled into philosophy, art, religion, and science. When indigenous American astronomical observations reached Chinese scholars, they refined existing models. When European Renaissance humanism encountered Aztec philosophy through Pacific trade, both were transformed. The world was becoming one, messier, more complex, but fundamentally interconnected, centuries before our timeline achieved similar integration.
Act 4. The ultimate questions. The price of connection. The most profound implications emerge when we consider what this alternative timeline reveals about the costs and benefits of early globalization. In this world where the Mongols mastered the sea and connected Asia to America 200 years before Columbus, the indigenous peoples of the Americas faced colonization earlier but differently. The Mongol and Chinese approach to America was exploitative but not genocidal. They sought tribute and trade, not territory and religious conversion. Indigenous populations declined from disease, mortality rates of 50 to 60% from introduced pathogens between 1284 and 1450. This is comparable to the disaster that struck indigenous Americans in our timeline after European contact. But in the alternative timeline, the demographic collapse happened more gradually, over 150 years rather than 50 years. Populations had time to adapt, develop partial immunity, and maintain political structures even while drastically reduced. When Europeans arrived in the 1490s, 1500s, they found indigenous empires weakened but not destroyed. The Aztec Empire still existed, though with half its pre-contact population. Complex chiefdoms still controlled much of North America. Indigenous peoples had metal weapons, horses, and established diplomatic relations with Asian trading powers. The European colonization that followed was still violent, still exploitative, still characterized by slavery and oppression. But it couldn't achieve the near total demographic and cultural erasure that occurred in our timeline, because the indigenous peoples had 200 years of preparation and partial biological adaptation. It suggests a disturbing truth. Early contact with Eurasian diseases, while catastrophic, might have been less catastrophic than later contact would be, and the timing of colonization might matter as much as its methods.
The empire that couldn't last. By 1300, in this alternative timeline, the peak of Mongol maritime power, the empire controlled or influenced territories from Hungary to Japan to California. It was the first world empire, spanning 3 continents and 2 oceans. But it couldn't last. The Mongol Empire fragmented in this timeline much as it did in ours, subdividing into competing khanates by the 1350s. The Yuan dynasty in China fell to the Ming in 1368, just as in our timeline. But the Pacific connections, once established, persisted beyond the empire's political fragmentation. The Ming maintained trade with America. The post-Mongols Central Asian khanates continued overland Silk Road commerce. European powers began establishing their own American colonies. The indigenous American states, though weakened, remained players in a multipolar system. What emerged was not a single world empire, but something more complex, a genuine world system where no single power dominated, where trade and diplomacy connected distant regions, and where cultural exchange flowed in multiple directions. It was messy, chaotic, and characterized by constant conflict. But it was also more balanced than the European-dominated world order that emerged in our timeline after 1492. The question becomes, is a multipolar world system with earlier but less total colonization better than a unipolar system with later but more complete colonization? The roads not taken. What historians discovered next would challenge everything about how we understand historical inevitability. The alternative timeline demonstrates that European dominance of global affairs, which characterized our world from roughly 1500 to 1945, was not inevitable. It resulted from specific circumstances: Europe's late but technologically advanced arrival in America, their encounter with demographically catastrophic virgin soil epidemics, and their development of maritime technology during the Age of Exploration. In the alternative timeline, Europe arrived late to an America that was already integrated into Pacific trade networks. They had maritime technology, but so did the Ming Chinese, arguably superior technology. They had guns and steel, but so did the post-Mongol American states that had been trading with Asia for 200 years. European colonization still occurred, but it never achieved the global hegemony that characterized our timeline. The world of 1700 in the alternative timeline was multipolar. European powers controlled the Atlantic, Chinese powers dominated the Pacific, and indigenous American states maintained autonomy in the interior. The Industrial Revolution, when it came in the 1700s, emerged simultaneously in Europe, China, and Mesoamerica, all regions with sufficient capital accumulation, technological sophistication, and labor conditions to support mechanization. The modern world that emerged by 1800 was fundamentally different, more balanced, more diverse, but also more fragmented and prone to conflict between multiple competing power centers. Which raises the ultimate question: is concentration of power more dangerous than distribution of power, or vice versa? Our timeline saw European dominance lead to colonialism, slavery, and massive exploitation, but also to relatively stable international systems once that dominance was established. The alternative timeline saw more balanced power, but constant great power competition and frequent wars between multiple empires. Both paths led to suffering. Both paths led to progress. Neither was obviously superior.
Conclusion. We began this journey asking, what if the Mongols conquered the seas and reached America 200 years before Columbus? We've seen a world where history's greatest land empire became history's greatest maritime empire, where East met West across the Pacific before Europe discovered the Atlantic route, where indigenous American civilizations faced colonization earlier but with more time to adapt and resist. It's a world where globalization came 300 years early, bringing both its benefits and its catastrophes ahead of schedule, where pandemics became truly global, where the collision of civilizations happened on multiple fronts simultaneously, where no single power dominated the modern world. But we've also discovered something unexpected, that the timing and nature of contact between civilizations might matter more than we realized, that gradual connection, while still devastating, might be less catastrophic than sudden encounter, that multipolar power systems, while more conflict-prone, might prevent the total cultural erasure that characterized European colonialism in our timeline. Perhaps the real lesson is that there are no clean alternatives. Every path through history carries both light and shadow. The Mongol Maritime Empire brought earlier connection and more balanced power, but also earlier pandemics and constant imperial warfare. European dominance in our timeline brought stability through hegemony, but also near total indigenous demographic collapse and cultural genocide. The historical consensus recognizes both truths: that the meeting of civilizations is inevitable once seafaring technology exists, but that the consequences of that meeting depend profoundly on timing, power balance, and the specific cultural attitudes of the colonizers.
The history contains infinite oceans. The storms that change everything are countless. The shores we never reached extend beyond imagination. But in every timeline, one truth remains: that the collision between civilizations, whether by land or sea, early or late, gradual or sudden, is one of history's most powerful and unpredictable forces. And perhaps the real question isn't which collision was better, but what our own timeline's particular sequence of encounters has made us capable of understanding. Would you have been the Mongol sailor who kept rowing when the typhoon struck, choosing duty over fear? Would you have been the Aztec diplomat who negotiated with strange invaders rather than fight them? Would you have been the indigenous elder who embraced early disease exposure to protect future generations? These choices between resistance and accommodation, between isolation and connection, between short-term security and long-term adaptation, are choices that every society faces when encountering the unknown. And the wisdom with which we make them determines whether collision becomes catastrophe or transformation.